Happy Friday. Happy Friday. Hey, Tatiana, thanks for joining me. Hopefully, those of you who catch our regular FPF LinkedIn Lives and YouTube Lives, I think we've got this streaming there too, well recognize our Director of AI Legislation and all-around rock star, Tatiana Rice, who's joining me because we are going to talk about the proliferation. Oh, I'm a little jet lagged from a red eye from the ABA Privacy Law Conference, a lot of the leading privacy counsel, where this was also a topic of interest. Yes, we're going to talk about the proliferation of AI state legislation around the country. And let me start off with just a perspective. In an ideal world, we, and I think anyone who is optimistic about the role tech and data and AI can play, recognizes that these are rules that ought to be done at a federal level. Whatever the debate about differentiating privacy rules by state or the like, we've got a long history of sort of sector-specific privacy rules and a long history. And I think it's clear we need a national privacy bill. We absolutely need federal leadership on this issue. It's certainly not ideal for startups or big companies or researchers or anyone to have to figure out how to tweak, their code state by state. But we don't see a federal path imminent. We'll come back and talk a little bit about perhaps what prospects there are at some point, but we don't have a privacy bill yet. Maybe we'll see the feds working on kids. We've seen Senator Cruz indicate that he sees both most opportunity and priority and most consensus around kids, and then maybe privacy. So state legislators are concerned. We'll see the gap. I've said many times as a former state legislator, if you come and told me don't legislate on the most compelling issue of the day because the federal government might come in to save the day, I'd have laughed at you. It was my job to do so for the citizens of New York. Representative State Senator Gio Capriglione of Texas, the leader of AI efforts and privacy efforts in the state legislature, chair of a leading select committee, close to all the Republican leadership, very conservative and pragmatic state legislator. His privacy bill, which Senator Cruz has called a model for federal legislation, is a very practical, I'd say, data-friendly model. Has introduced a very significant Texas bill after a long effort of local committee meetings, local hearings, local meetings with Texan stakeholders. And he's quoted today in one of the publications covering the discussions about state privacy, state AI legislation, as being concerned about the harms that algorithms can do for people of Texas. Not that he doesn't appreciate, the opportunity and the goal of Texas being a leader in AI, an economic leader, but there is a deep and real concern by many legislators that we need to put the right guardrails in place, or we will indeed see the risks. This representative is on the leadership committee of the FPF multi-stakeholder, multi-state AI legislators group, but this is a bill that he primarily developed with local experts. He worked in he is a legislator, has worked closely with the important Texas Public Policy Foundation, a real voice of conservative and Republican and national influence on these issues. We first saw this bill when it was released as a draft and then discussed last week by the multi-stakeholder group in a hearing where they looked at this bill. They looked at Senator Maroney's Connecticut bill, and industry and advocates and trade groups and free market people all shared their input. So it's very much, I think, indicative of where many both Democrat and, in this case, deeply conservative Republican legislators who certainly want to support the economy and want to support AI leadership, but do believe that you need guardrails in place. So touch on it. That's Texas. Colorado is the first place where we really have, people have been calling it a comprehensive AI law, but it's not really comprehensive, right? AI legislation can cover and often covers a vast scope of activity. Let's start with Colorado and then do sort of a lightning tour with some of the differences and nuances. Some critics are calling many of these bills, mini EU AI acts. And in fact, there's huge diversity in some of these bills. Some are heavy and restrictive. The Texas one, which I think we are optimistic will end up in a very practical place, but had elements that I think like a new agency or a very broad scope, that we certainly would advise are far too wide. But then there are also bills that are frankly very friendly to AI, friendly to business, and maybe more optimistic that are moving and being introduced in other states.
Yeah, so as a lot of people are right now, everybody's kind of watching the states on legislation and what's kind of happening, and it can be extremely overwhelming as to like what is actually happening, what's moving, what are the models, are there actually categories, etc. And I think you're completely right in saying that the Texas model or the Texas framework TREGA takes a more comprehensive approach than what we've seen in other kinds of trends we've identified this year and even last year. And we say that it's more comprehensive in that it is covering a range of technologies as well as a range of issues. And you compare that against bills like Colorado's AI Act, which is focusing specifically on high-risk AI uses, right? So AI that is being developed and deployed, particularly in specific categories such as housing, employment, education, and it's focused on mostly one particular risk, which is algorithmic bias. So even if you're looking at technologies that are implicated and the kind of risks that are being evaluated, these are very different bills. But in terms of what we're actually seeing for trends and what is actually seem to be moving, it's no surprise that a lot of bills that are moving are ones that are already based on existing law, right? So this is not a new kind of phenomenon, especially in data privacy laws. Like most folks tend to build upon each other. So of course, there is a number of bills that are doing something that looks like Colorado, focusing on high-risk AI uses in things like automated decision-making. That kind of term of automated decision-making, focusing on areas that have legal or similarly significant effects in these kind of areas of, again, housing, employment, education. We saw a bill out of Virginia get passed this past year or this past week. New Mexico passed another version that is a little bit more expansive. There's also a bill in Nebraska, a bill in Maryland. So we are seeing a lot of folks kind of taking that approach. But I think one thing that is interesting, and maybe is a result of the current environment, is that most of these bills are far more narrow than Colorado is actually, because they're dictating or they're trying to regulate when AI systems are essentially the principal basis of a consequential decision, meaning that there's very little human intervention or involvement in these systems, which means that the actual scope of technologies that are regulated is very narrow. But aside from the high-risk automated decision-making bills like Colorado, also seeing generally two other categories making movement, which is bills focused on employment specifically. And that's also no surprise, given that New York City Local Law 144 was enacted a number of years ago, became enforceable, I believe, last year. So a lot of folks, especially in New York, are really focused on employment. And then last year, California passed a number of generative AI transparency laws, AB 2013 and SB 942, which are also getting copycatted in other states. So that includes Washington has a version of it. Part of that was actually included in the New Mexico automated decision-making bill as well. So I would say those three general categories are ones to be paying attention to as we're trying to figure out, what is passing, what is moving, what's important to be watching.
Now, what was the number of the one that passed in Texas that Governor Newsom vetoed that Elon Musk had supported? That was
Yeah. It's a really good point to make. SB 1047, and that focused specifically on foundation models, right? So these very large computational threshold power models that actually are a very small subset, but there was a lot of concerns around open source and the implications of regulating that type of technology for safety risks. I do think it's an interesting distinction that I think a lot of people are trying to equate the Texas bill with something like SB 1047, which understandably they're trying to make the argument that they're both strongly regulatory models. But in terms of the actual substance of the regulation, they're completely different. Like nowhere in Capriglione's bill is he talking about foundation models.
Now, speaking of different models, let's discuss a bit. I've seen people talk about the model bill that comes out of the FPF multi-stakeholder group. I haven't seen a model bill. Do you have one that you're hiding somewhere, or that some of the legislators there are hiding? I think you said that what we're seeing is legislators looking at what has passed, what others are moving. This is the norm, frankly. We saw this in state privacy legislation where you had states like looking to replicate California, others that were, recognizing that there were some key things that everyone was going to have to do because California required it, like providing subject access requests and the like, but then areas where they wanted to be more flexible. So obviously Colorado, and at the time Colorado was moving, Connecticut was moving, it passed both houses, it didn't succeed at the end. And those bills had lots of debate and discussion and hearings very early on in the process. And again, do have this sort of high risk, low risk model, which was something that industry was advocating for both in those states and frankly in the EU AI Act. Certainly the EU AI Act is, we did a interesting graphic showing how many regulators are involved and how many conflicting areas, and are deeply aware of kind of the heavy weight that that may put on. But one success that those who were debating and arguing and providing input in that bill had is that they did introduce a high risk, low risk model, or shall we say a risk-based model. The criticism sometimes of, say, the GDPR is that advertising has no risk, right? But the things that are perhaps smaller risk can sometimes leave you with massive penalties or very significant obligations. Cross-border data flows can leave you with billions of dollars, and other areas. And so just say a bit more about what that group is. Capriglione, we mentioned, was a member. Senator Maroney of Connecticut is the chair. The leaders have included leaders from Connecticut and Virginia and elsewhere. What do the members, and again, members I think is sometimes somewhat loose here. There's obviously a group that has put their name out as leadership, but some of these are folks who are joining an email list because they've said, sure, invite me when you hold a briefing or a discussion. It's mostly an educational group of legislators. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, certainly. And I think generally, again, like the main function of the group was, one, to be able to convene these lawmakers together so they're able to share ideas kind of more easily and have that infrastructure in place to be able to do that, and to be able to convene with experts in the space who they otherwise probably would have been interacting with during a legislative session anyways, but they can start kind of that preparation of education process. We started this years ago, but, really started this past session back in late last summer. I think it was July or August, starting out that process. And now that, we're kind of in the legislative session, there were those public feedback sessions, and now the lawmakers are kind of just doing their thing at this point. And so, yeah, I mean, they're continuing to talk to each other, just as they, I think, ordinarily would. But the multi-state thing is not, formally convening every few weeks or anything like that. But I think on the note about the model bill is really interesting because I do think like if FPF was to do a model bill, it would be funny just to see how it contrasts with what's out there and what people think we think. But generally, like, of course, a core goal of the multi-state group is just to have these lawmakers talking to each other. So Senator Maroney, who of course worked on the Connecticut Senate Bill 2 last year, which ultimately ended up getting enacted in Colorado, is shopping his bill around to multiple different lawmakers. Again, the goal is to create more consistency, to share ideas, to share approaches, and any lawmaker is free to do that, right? We have both Republicans and Democrats. People share bills kind of all the time, but the idea that people are kind of focusing on this model bill is certainly something that's coming from Senator Maroney because he is just generally an AI leader in the space right now.
And since many of these bills really in determining what is, I mean, one of the concerns some have had is, well, if I'm going to just, market a little better, or I'm going to use AI in some, in my calculator in some, basic ways, all of a sudden I'll be caught up with obligations. And you pointed out that a lot of these bills they don't try to create new notions of what is high risk. They point to current civil rights laws. I was rereading recently the first Trump administration's AI guidance, and there was sort of clear recognition that to the extent that there are traditional civil rights laws protecting against discrimination around housing, employment, and so forth, just because AI is involved doesn't mean all the bets are off and those laws aren't applicable. And so the notion of making sure that we continue to safeguard those rights instead of what? I mean, what are they worried about? If some have said, well, if it's already kind of covered by the law, why do you need to say, well, because AI is involved or AI is controlling the decision, that you need new law?
Yeah, I think that's like a legitimate policy debate to have, because you have seen entities like the EEOC or FTC enforce under their existing authority for algorithmic discrimination. But if you ask most civil rights attorneys, they'll say that the law is far behind the technology. And you can kind of see this in the example of, I've heard, the advent of cars, for example, things that were harmful like murdering or harming people were already illegal, but you create things like safety laws and standards to mitigate those risks of harm even further, to mitigate those kind of criminal statutes or civil statutes that are already in place. So the goal, of course, is to be able to, protect and provide more transparency, but in an area where civil rights laws were created in the 60s, and there's a lot of ambiguity and gray area regarding how those really old laws apply to these really new technologies. There's a lot of ambiguities on how businesses are supposed to be complying with civil rights laws with these new technologies that are getting implicated and deployed in areas protected by civil rights laws. And so I do think a lot of the goal with these lawmakers, and Maroney has said this, Rodriguez has said this, is not that the law is punitive, but it's providing more certainty to these folks of what they should be doing to comply with the existing law and create more transparency for consumers.
Yeah, the EUA Act is so often invoked, and as people who work day to day with many of the leading companies, the makers of every major foundation model, startups, companies, who are leaning hard into using AI, the challenge they are having today is not the EUA Act, partly because it's only starting to come into effect, but significantly because GDPR has long had significant regulation around automated decisioning and profiling and collecting sensitive data. And there is real doubt today whether or not GDPR, as the Italian regulator, as many other regulators, as prominent members of the EDPB, allows generative AI. I mean, how do you scrape data and use it for very unrelated purposes? How do you scrape sensitive personal information and use it for the vast number of purposes? Do the models, quote unquote, contain personal information? California has by law tried to just say models contain personal information. Europe we've seen some DPAs, Hamburg and others, seeking more flexibility, and then others, saying, well, where we see it spitting out personal information. We do see the companies starting to use more sophisticated techniques to try to make sure they don't scan personal information in the input. Obviously, a lot of work already done trying to make sure it doesn't spit out personal information, except, I mean, if you search, and many of them are now providing search, Jules Polonetsky or Elon Musk, obviously you should, get a readout of biographical personal information. And so I understand why the need to provide a kind of almost legislative framework is going to provide some assurance, as well as hopefully assure those like those legislators who are aware of some of the risks. So Virginia just passed through one of the houses, a bill from Delegate Maldonado. Do you want to say anything about that? Virginia, obviously an interesting sort of purple, red, sometimes blue.
Yeah, it's a really interesting bellwether because it's one of the first bills of this like Colorado type of model to be moving in a significant way, because Virginia has a much shorter legislative session, but it is because they have also like a split in terms of like their party. And so the bill was passed by party lines, so that is something to be keeping aware of. But at the same time, we are seeing other Republicans introducing bills focused on AI. So I'm sure we'll talk about this in a second, but there certainly isn't one singular approach that Republicans or conservatives are kind of taking on the issue. But generally, in the Virginia model, as I mentioned earlier, it does take a much more narrow approach than Colorado because of how they're scoping the bill. So both of them use this language where an AI has to be a substantial factor in the consequential decision to be regulated under the bill. But Virginia's definition of substantial factor essentially is that the AI system had to have been performed with little or no human involvement or intervention. So that significantly narrows the scope of the bill. And again, I think there's a lot of folks who are really concerned about the innovation economy, who are maybe getting a little caught up in the actual application of these laws or to technologies like foundation models and things like that, where you have to be using there's a use-based type of approach, right? You have to be using the technology for this particular purpose for it to come under scope of the bill. And not only that, you have to be using the technology in a way that is overshadowed by any kind of level of human involvement or intervention to become within scope of the bill. So again, a lot of consumer advocates, a lot of civil rights people are very concerned that this actually doesn't regulate a ton. But hopefully we'll see how this kind of plays out in the environment that we're in right now.
Yeah, so important note. Not only are these fairly tied to sort of data protection, discrimination type issues, but even then only to those that are high risk like employment or housing, and even then only when the AI really sort of is this dominant factor. They don't cover these broad foundation models that might do anything and everything. They don't cover the existential risk, the systemic risk, a vast number of what are frankly significant and important AI bills, as opposed to the EU AI Act, which does try to be a sort of all things and not and in fact, the data protection pieces that are kind of the focus here are kind of a small part of the EU AI Act, are probably much more detailed. Gabriela Zanfa-Fortuna, our colleague who leads the global team, and her staff did a deep dive into all of the different states, all of the different DPA decisions in Europe over years that frame the laws around automated decisioning. And there's just such a long history of case law there. That's really the law of AI when it comes to the issues that we're looking at here in the States. The EU AI Act, which of course has a very significant tier that we're not seeing in these bills either. The EU AI Act has high risk, low risk, and then thou shalt not risk, right? And a list of things that are just verboten. You can't do it. And I think the US framing is being far more open to that. Sam Adams says to,
Hi, Sam.
Are you seeing any effort in legislatures to regulate scraping specifically?
Good question. Yeah, so we did see in California last year, I think this was a focus, something that people were really concerned about. But I actually would say more advancements are happening through Attorney General guidance on this, actually. So the Oregon Attorney General and New Jersey Attorney General, and I think Massachusetts last year, all put out guidance regarding how their existing data privacy laws apply to AI. All of them pretty, they do talk about scraping, and they talk about scraping, I think, being a practice that is under consideration. And I think it is something that is, especially if you're thinking about comparing what is publicly available data, which is exempt from data privacy laws, versus personal data, which is defined in a very variety of different ways. So at a high level, yes, but I wouldn't say in terms of like the AI legislation landscape, it's a primary consideration.
You alluded to sort of the broader, view of like, is this going to be a party thing, Democratic, Republican, or where we know certainly from the last couple of years, whether it's the Dems or the Biden administration, there was obviously a big focus on algorithmic bias and protecting civil rights and that range. And so maybe not super surprising that we see a bit of a pushback from some of the free market folks who are worried that new rights or the cultural rights that they are debating and advocating against today end up being implicated. I think these bills, by kind of viewing narrowly to current civil rights law, avoid that. But there's certainly bigger voices in town who are VC voices, who are little tech, as they call them, the startups of the world, or the don't rush to regulate because that ends up being a roadblock for business. But it does seem that when it comes to privacy regulation and even now AI regulation, we do see, Republicans, whether in Congress, the bipartisan House report that mapped out how to think about regulating AI, I think did a very sophisticated job recognizing both optimism and interest in U.S. leadership, as well as a significant range of concerns. And then whether you look at Texas or other states, you see local legislators responding to the concerns. Trump won again. All bets are off. The new administration is charting new paths in many ways, but Trump won. Some of the leaders who are stepping back in as technology leaders, the CTO and so forth, were very involved in some fairly sophisticated AI guidance, both to government agencies and more broadly. Musk, we noted, supporter of the fairly heavy California bill, state legislators responding to constituents. So I think there's a much more nuanced approach. We saw some of the free market folks sort of calling for the US to maybe drop out of the OECD, to not sign on to these safety accords. The first big global agreement on AI, one that was facilitated by the OECD, the US signed on to, but didn't just sign on to, helped lead, played a big role in ensuring that the language, was suitable and compatible. And of course, we've just heard that JD Vance is going to be heading off to be the U.S. voice at the Paris AI Summit, where Korea and Paris and at a presidential level and top level of governments around the world, leaders are convening to talk about how to collaborate, lead, win, regulate around AI. And so, I think there's one view that win, and don't place any limits. China has privacy regulation, privacy and AI regulation. And yes, there are way broad areas where the government can override it, but on making sure that their commercial sector works for consumers, they can be quite sophisticated in looking at models around the world. The entire APEC region is regulating in a fairly sophisticated way, also eager to have leadership. Korea, where you certainly have some AI champions, and obviously Samsung and other global tech players. And so I think we'd argue, and our team will be over at the AI Summit participating, U.S. companies don't win just by having a market in the U.S. They use data, move data, and can and should play an active role leading the way and being a voice of optimism for how tech and data can be used, but also how you put safeguards in place that are practical and effective. So I think those who want to put this in a box of, the left wants to regulate, the right doesn't, or small tech doesn't need any regulation, I think it's a much more nuanced, deep, and important debate. And there may be partisan elements, but then frankly, lots of areas where we all share mutual interest in doing so. Closing thought?
Yeah, I mean, I think you really succinctly said it there, Jules. I think it's a highly nuanced area where I think folks want to be able to put it into more ideological terms. And of course, there are ideological conversations to be had regarding regulation versus no regulation. But I think there are substantive policy conversations happening below that level that are even more important as we think about AI governance moving forward. Because I think regardless of kind of what ends up happening at the federal level, a lot of these states are going to move, whether you like it or not. It's reality. It's not something that, of course, FPF is pushing, but it's just the reality of the situation. So kind of how you're coming to the table, talking about should small businesses and startups be exempt, legitimate policy question to have. How should existing law already apply? And can you exempt that from all of these new standalone laws, right? These are conversations to have. And I do think there are really good substantive policy conversations that are happening that unfortunately may be getting a little lost in the noise.
I'll close with our role in the process because, despite all this discussion about the bills, we're not lobbyists, we're not government affairs people, we have no political, sway. Our day-to-day life is working with the senior people in privacy and AI, companies, policymakers, schools, researchers, and being a resource in an incredibly complex area where even the biggest expert in, a particular area maybe doesn't know what's happening in Korea, doesn't know what the latest technology development in South America is, doesn't understand the laws around global data flows. Our day-to-day is helping the senior people, at 230 or so organizations, companies, trades, research universities, keep track of what's going on, analyze, understand, talk to each other, work on best practices, peer-to-peer discussions, to be sophisticated enough to keep up with what's going on so they can give good advice and guidance at their organizations. And then we turn to the policy world and we try to play a bit of a unique role. There are trade groups saying, do good for business. And there are civil society groups saying, this is what individuals need and societal concerns. And what we try to do with those stakeholders, civil society, state legislator, data protection authority, Federal Trade Commission, is be a resource for them. Our view is that if you understand the data flows, if you understand the technology, if you understand the conflicting laws, the realities of compliance, what works and what doesn't work, you will make better decisions. We have opinions. If you ask us, we occasionally will opine. We did support, for instance, the Colorado and Connecticut bills at a high level because we do think state legislators working off of a common playbook and avoiding incredibly discordant patchwork is not a great idea. But we rarely do and don't typically. What you do see us doing is helping legislators talk to each other, helping regulators talk to each other, learn from each other, connecting with experts of every sort, free market, those advocating more regulation, and everything in between, in the hope that we move forward in a way that is thoughtful, that doesn't create friction. We definitely have a bias towards interoperability and rules that can be complied with because our day-to-day supporters simply want to be able to say to their business partners, to their legal clients, you can do this, you can't do that. Here's how much risk, that is. Here's and in a world where there's conflicting laws that aren't crafted well, so that we don't even know what they mean. that creates sort of an overhead that we want to eliminate. Okay, delighted to catch up with you today, and I hope our listeners appreciated it. Happy Friday, everybody. And next week, Safer Internet Day. Did you know there was a Safer Internet Day? There is. We will be releasing an update to one of our very popular infographics that showed how encryption is used in the course of our lives. And we're going to be focusing on children, because a lot of these laws that seem to want backdoors or ways to provide lawful access to encrypted data are doing it because of concerns about the risks to children and child exploitation. And obviously, as we see from the lawful access mechanisms that were created for telco data, which now have been exploited by foreign adversaries, the concerns that creating those backdoors puts everyone's data at risk is significant. The UK seems to be moving forward in that direction with some announcements about how it has demanded that Apple provide global access to encrypted cloud data. Obviously, other countries could demand that of them now and of other services. And I think here in the US, where we have some real concerns about government access to individual data now and at other times, and certainly foreign adversary access, it just seems a really bad time to break the guarantee that exists today that I can encrypt data that my government, other governments, bad actors, nobody can have access to. Yes, that does mean that some bad actors will exploit that, but I think there's a vast number of ways that we can go after those actors. And if there was some magical super science way that we could somehow say, well, it will only ever be accessed by good governments doing the kinds of things that democratic society would approve of, I'd be all for it. But we don't only have democratic governments. We don't only have good democratic governments, and we have, bad actors. So join us for Safer Internet Day information at our event pages. And Tatiana, thanks to you and the team.
Yeah, thanks, Jules. Thanks all.